Oh, the record secretary, yeah. Read the minutes of the last meeting.
Hey. An ordinary public business meeting of the College Historical Society took place on the 14th of October 2009 with Kate Fitzgerald, Communications Director and former Chair of Democrats Abroad, in the chair. Abroad, you say? Yes, she was indeed a woman. The motion that this House believes the American dream is dead was that this House believes that the American dream is dead. The dream itself, contrary to popular belief, is not about eating the world's largest marshmallow, but bears several key resemblances to it. They're both naturally appealing, amorphous and hard to get at, attract a lot of wasps, and can conflict with one's constitutions very seriously. The dream is grounded in the simple and enduring principle that any white person, regardless of their trust fund, regardless of the Ivy League university that their parents sent them to, can have a bigger house than their neighbour and a bigger fence than the West Bank. The first speaker for the opposition made the point that America does not have a history. This point has frequently been made throughout the last 500 years of American history to justify their barbarism. Stephen Buggy then countered with an exceptionally passable defence of mediocrity. This is clearly an ideal that stands very close to Stephen's heart. The American dream was then defended by John Engel, the American patriot who, in the tradition of Irish patriots, has chosen to get out of his country as soon as possible by studying abroad. Dr. Sean Byrne of TCD then stressed that the focus on the American dream should be not on its results, but on the effects of the minds of the next generation, the belief that the children are our future. But tonight we must turn from the issue of youth in America to that of euthanasia. It has often been noted that debates about such big ideas as euthanasia can turn a lot of people off, especially the elderly and infirm. So, to lighten things up this evening, I've resolved to tell a classical joke. I took my grandmother to the vet the other day, and because she's cross-eyed, and as the vet was lifting her up and looking at her, he said, "I'm afraid we're going to have to put her down." "Because she's cross-eyed?" I said. "No, because she's too heavy, and a drain on public resources." There being no further business, the meeting adjourned.
So, are there any objections to me signing these minutes? There are none. Yeah. You won't be signing.
Yeah. Okay, welcome to the debate this evening. I'd just like to introduce all the guests first. In the chair, we have Professor Thomas O'Dowd, who's Professor of General Practice in Trinity College Dublin. In proposition, we have Dick Spicer, who's the chair of the Irish Humanist Association. And in opposition, we have Dr. Donal O'Mathuna, who's a nursing lecturer from DCU. Everybody got an oratory return, which is what this is, on their seat. Basically what it does is it gives you an opportunity to grade all the student speakers out of 100. There's kind of like the guidelines on the side. What this is basically is for, at the end of the year, we aggregate all the scores, and whoever gets the highest average gets the gold medal for their, if they reach that high, or mark of thanks if they don't reach that high, at the end of the year. And it's considered a great privilege to get an award by the society at the end of the year. So if you could kindly just sign in what you think everybody got, and then hand them to Bella, who will be standing at the door at the end of the debate. That'd be great. Also, if anybody wants to speak, make an impromptu speech towards the end for about 4 or 5 minutes. If you just want to pass your name to the front, we'll try and put you in. So with that, I'll leave you back to the chair to introduce the first speaker.
Thank you very much. So the motion is that this House would legalise euthanasia. And the first speaker, first proposition is Catherine Murphy.
Years ago, when the mighty fell, whether in battle or because illness rendered them so weak, so powerless, so much a subsection of who they once were, we let them choose. We let them choose to lie down, we let them choose to stop the pain, we let them choose how it is they would leave the world. Yet, now when the elderly are riddled with illness and pain, they're drained of all spirit and all fight and all will, and most importantly, all capacity for control. We insist that they continue. We insist that they count days or time in seconds of unimaginable agony, seconds that in fact do last days, because we believe in life. It is my belief that the slowest common denominator bastardisation of what it is to be human both rots our fabric and asks the impossible for a nebulous concept. I have 3 points. First, I'm going to look at why human life is important. I'm going to look at what a free society is, and I'm going to talk about the effects that not introducing this policy has in general. So why is human life important? Because we hear all the time that life itself represents the pinnacle of humanity, that we must preserve it at all costs and irrespective of all consequences. But is life in and of itself a good thing? Does the mere act of breathing in and out validate you as a human being? Surely it has to be more, ladies and gentlemen. Surely life is important because it certainly facilitates other rights, but also because it allows, by which I mean, I know, stereotypical debate sentence, it facilitates all other rights, but what does that mean? It means it allows you to think, to be, to act accordingly to whom you are, or to who you are, and to, in fact, to decide for yourself who you are. And we place huge importance, in general, on choice as a cornerstone of society. We allow things to be not because they're objectively most optimal for the most number of people, but rather because people choose them. We differentiate between who we are individually and who we are collectively, based on a sense of advancement and free will we claim to have over animals. And we allow that even to justify our actions to them. So how is it in this context we can say to value human life to such an extreme manner, when the manner in which we demonstrate this commitment overrides all decision-making powers we consider so vital day to day? Like, I would contend that life is only important so far as it permits you to make other choices, and at the point at which we prioritise that living over the ability to make those choices, or indeed any of those decisions themselves, we fail to understand what it means to be alive. Furthermore, I want to talk about free society and why it is not allowing euthanasia negates our ability to have one. Because all of us are very fortunate to live in Western liberal democracies and to have the privilege of living in societies which accept the value and merit, or accept that there is a value in each and every one of us. Societies that recognise that legitimacy stems from the people, that societies do in fact and should in fact give us education, give us healthcare, give us voting rights and rights in general. Societies that say we are all equal in the law and that all must be accountable for their actions, and who allow us to believe in who and what we want so long as it harms no other. These societies have at their core, surely, an aim and intent to make each of us the best us we can be, and they represent a respect for individual free will that was learned through a lot of hard oppressive lessons throughout history. This recognition of the dangers of oppression has obviously led to a prioritisation of the individual over the collective. Yet it's in this particular final hurdle that we're going to discuss this evening, no thank you, that we once again, for some reason, revert to the rhetoric of old, that your life is not, in fact, yours to decide, that you cannot possibly decide its worth, that you cannot possibly evaluate it accurately, that you, the only one who feels your pain, you, the only one who knows what each experience means to you, could possibly, no thank you, could possibly have ownership over that life. Somewhat of a no thank you, of a quandary. Like, instead it says, you must live. Your will is supplanted to those who believe your life serves them. No thank you. No thank you. Those who seek to hijack your freedom and hold your choices hostage. Ladies and gentlemen, gone are the tribal leaders, are the kings and queens, are the dictators and the prophets. And unfortunately, freedom has a new nemesis. No thank you. It has the new nemesis that hides, that is in fact hidden, that is purely nebulous. It's this idea of society, the nebulous society, which will destroy you in order to save you. No thank you, inexplicably. You don't even get to rebel to this concept of society because they justify all of their actions as being good for you and in your interest. And we think that, like, and I would say that the reality is that actually no one wants to think about death. No one wants to deal with death until it's upon us. And they absolutely keep you alive, I would contend, so as to feel better about your pain. And that can't be allowed if we're ever truly going to be free. Furthermore, I think the problem with not legalising euthanasia is that it has a couple of effects. Because I'm sure we're going to hear a lot this evening about the effects, the kind of effects that this proposition will have. The kind of harms that people will assert will, I'm sure, include the elderly being killed in their sleep and lots of other horrible things. To which I would say 4 things. I'd say, firstly, instances of illegal deaths actually don't increase as a result of euthanasia being... instances of illegal deaths amongst people as a result of euthanasia has not increased where it's been legalised. So in that instance, we say, I don't think that there's a huge amount for abuses if you look at places like Oregon. So there are ways of having cooling off periods. But moreover, I'd say uptake in places where they've legalised euthanasia isn't actually that high. The point about freedom is that and the way it's evidenced, I think, is the fact that people feel a comfort knowing that they can take control of a situation if they need to. They feel less free, and are in fact less free, when they feel like that choice isn't even there to be taken up. And moreover, I'd say, what you have in a situation where you don't have euthanasia legalised is that people take the pill while they can, or take tablets the way they can swallow so as to kill themselves, instead of waiting to perhaps a point at which they wouldn't have had to waste valuable days and worthwhile days living with their families, and that's a harm in and of itself. But also, I would say, I'm going to agree with a lot of what I'm sure the opposition are going to say. I do think it's reasonable to expect children to change their parents' clothes, to shower them, to feed them, to do whatever it is that you might call demeaning, that you might call a loss of dignity. I think all of those things are reasonable demands of children and of the people around a loved one who is dying. What I don't think is reasonable is to expect people to look into the faces of relatives who are filled with overwhelming desperation, who are filled with overwhelming pain, who are filled with an overwhelming sense of frustration and betrayal, and tell them that I'm sorry, the only way I can give you enough medication so as to stop the pain is to kill you. I want you to imagine that situation, ladies and gentlemen. I want you to imagine that pain. I want you to imagine saying those words to someone you genuinely love, and then I want you to do the right thing. I want you to vote for humanity over nonsensical principles and propose this motion. Thank you.
Well, I want to call on Finbarr to Legalise, first opposition.
Right. Mr. Chair, Auditor, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to oppose the motion this House would legalise euthanasia, and I'm going to do so hopefully strongly, so thank you for your attention. I would first just like to say a few things about what Catherine has said, because she's put forward this idea that society is going to reach into your lives and start killing people. It's not true. In the few countries where euthanasia is legalised, the decision is entirely between the person and the doctor and the family. It is completely within that context. The power belongs to the patient. Anyway, that's probably the strongest argument you can ever have, is that someone needs free will, and that's why euthanasia should be legalised, but I'm not going to argue that. I would like to place my speech within context, which is the context of physician-assisted dying. Okay? I'm just going to do this to avoid the confusion between 2 separate moral issues. One being someone having the right to choose to die, and the other being state having the right to turn off a life support machine. Because I'm going to tackle the first one, the second one is a completely different motion. I would need 2 speeches to deal with it. I'm not going to. I would also like to place my speech within the context of where I'm coming from this situation, because it will influence a lot of what I have to say coming on. I am a Christian. I believe that life is a divine gift given by God to people, and that basically every experience we have changes our character, shapes our soul, both the good and the bad, the pain and the suffering. And then I believe that when we die, during the afterlife, we are judged on everything we have experienced, and that taking any of that away is wrong. Now, I'm just saying that to get it out of the way, because it's going to be behind a lot of what I say, but I won't preach to you, so it's fine. I would like to talk about the Irish context. And actually, in my notes, this is written down as HSE, no, no, no. Okay? I don't claim the HSE is incompetent. My mother works for the HSE. I'm not allowed to claim they're incompetent. She'll kill me. But I do not see this ever working in Ireland. Not ever, sorry, now. Okay? When I look at the Netherlands, I see a completely different popular opinion, an attitude to things. They're a lot more open, they're a lot free. By the way, euthanasia is legal in the Netherlands, just in case anyone didn't know, which is sort of why I'm using them as sort of this case study. they talk about things. They talk about sexuality, death and suffering much more openly than we do in Ireland. In Ireland, you don't really talk about it. You know, you'd say someone's died, but you wouldn't really say how it's making you feel or anything like that. It's much more repressed, so that bit would not work. The only other thing I'd like to say about the Netherlands, really, is that their system is completely different to the system we have in operation in Ireland. The reason euthanasia works in this context in the Netherlands is because they have free healthcare, which is a very high standard. They have free care for the elderly, and a GP is likely to be your GP from when you're born until when you die. I mean, even if you move, you're going to know your GP quite well, because you don't have to shop around, because there isn't a sort of, no thank you, a primacy of private healthcare, which the government is currently trying to, put forward, and you don't go to a person because they're cheaper. You can stay with the same person. It's high quality. No, thank you. And because of that, the person knows you quite well, and if you're making a decision, then it's fine. This is why it would not work in Ireland. It's not why it won't work in general. I'm going to get onto that in a second. Basically, with current faith in the government, with public opinion in Ireland, with the state of our healthcare system, it just won't work. Because you end up with a dichotomy of people choosing, well, I'm going to put this pressure on my family, or am I going to die? That doesn't exist in other countries. And until Ireland gets its act together, which, to be honest, I don't think it will, for a very long time, it's just a thing. It's not going to work. I'd like to get on to the issue of restricting palliative care, which is, I think, a much better sort of solution to this sort of euthanasia question. We're not living in caves anymore. I hate to put this to you, but it's true. We've evolved long past that, and the average life expectancy has gone up. Even if you go back 200 years, people were dying of plagues, famines, they're probably malnourished. And if you go back even further, before they reached the sort of age where they would have, gotten to the point where they would starve because they can't feed themselves anymore, they might get run over by a mammoth or something. I mean, things happen to people a long time ago that aren't happening now. Now, if you reach an age, you're put in a sterile environment, you're probably not going to catch any of these sort of separate diseases that would kill you on top of everything that you've already got. No, thank you. And I think this is slightly unnatural. In fact, I know it's unnatural. Keeping people alive beyond a certain point is unnatural. And what I advocate, rather than euthanasia, is simply letting the people die who are supposed to die. I mean, human life is limited. We can keep people alive to a certain point, but when it comes down to it, when they stop being able to feed themselves, when they stop being able to think, or, no thank you, or do things like this, they're really not capable of taking care of themselves. So, we should just let them go. That's a completely natural thing. So, you just stop treating people after a point. It's the role of your healthcare system to sort of look after you until, no thank you, until you die. And that's it. But they shouldn't, keep you alive too long. Longer than you need to be alive for.
Sure.
Why not?
Who decides this natural term? The entire life that we lead today could be considered unnatural, and we can't just leave people on the streets dying from car accidents because they would have died had we not helped. What you seem to be saying is that you would allow for something that is quite similar to what a lot of people would say is euthanasia.
I would say that it's very easy to draw a line. It's not very easy, but it's possible to draw a line in modern medicine where you reach a point that we can help people very effectively, and then we can't help people very effectively. And there's a difference between issuing a lethal injection, tablets, or whatever into someone, and just letting them drift away as they would in that proper situation. And I view that, very indifferent. Now, I'd like to say that sort of healthcare provides closure to the family. A long, drawn-out illness is hard, but the suffering that you go through, you would go through anyway if that person died. The difference is if that person is with you, if that person is working through it with you, it's easier because they're still there, because you can talk to them about it, and you're like, this is hurting me, and I want, you to know this. And then when you finally go, it'll be a bit better because they're gone. And it's the end of a long drawn-out thing, but it's closure in a way that you need to get. Whereas, you could say, when you accept euthanasia, that maybe you prepare for it before, but it's not the same thing. You're saying to your loved one, it's okay, I don't mind if you die tomorrow, or, when you choose to die, but I really still don't want you to go. And you don't. Even if you allow for the fact that some people choose to die, it's the family that we have to look out after, because the person is dying. But they have a responsibility to their family to make sure their family are as okay with it as they can possibly be. And if that takes, the rest of their life it takes a lot of their pain, they still have to do it because you don't really have a choice. I mean, we live to serve those who come after us, and without that, what is the point? Anyway, I'd like to thank you for your time. And
thank you very much. The second proposition is William Quill.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Auditor, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen. Over the summer I was working on the Ireland for Europe campaigns, and one of the more ludicrous posters which we had was one from Cor where they had a picture of a fetus with a picture of someone on the sick bed and saying, would you trust the EU with their lives? Or something along those lines. And I found this offensive not just on the idea that Cor were so desperate that they threw everything the kitchen sink in, but even the idea, but really as someone who favours euthanasia, that they were completely misrepresenting the idea behind it. It's not about it's not a question of telling someone their time is up and that's it. It's about respecting their dignity. And I want to focus mainly on the principle of it, but I do want to get to the specifics. Catherine mentioned Oregon. I think it's worthwhile, towards the end of my speech, going into a bit of the specifics of what happens there. And I wanted, again, as Catherine said, we can't imagine the feeling of this desire to die. That doesn't mean we should doubt the sincerity of those people who do. And then Finbarr opened his speech by, honestly, I should add, by saying that he's a Christian, so his views on this come from that perspective. But I think in a democratic republican society, we have to think that for whatever reason, even if we disagree with something, we might hold a religious viewpoint, or maybe we have this personal conviction, a long-held family idea that you fight to the bitter end and that's it. We equally have to respect people who don't hold those beliefs as ourselves. And this is fundamentally a question of personal autonomy. Jamie, go ahead.
It's not really a belief, though. It's a value system.
Yeah, but
all laws are value systems.
I accept that it's a value system based on a belief, though. And I think this is a question, and that's why I think that it equally shouldn't be opposed from Europe if that's the case. I think it's something that we have to come to our own minds on, but I think it's something we have to respect these differences. And I think it comes down to the idea of who owns a life. If the state can stop somebody's request and their suffering and agony, can you say that somebody is in control of their own life? It's the state making a moral judgment that it knows better than somebody themselves what is in their own interest, which is really kind of... No thanks, Graham. I don't want to hark on about political ideas, but I do think it is this idea of the state knowing what's in your own interest is kind of, it's anti-republican. It's not how we view things in every other area of life. So why should we be different here? And it's entirely down to individual cases and how someone sees their own life. Someone who, in the later stage of their life, might find themselves in find themselves in a very different situation had they spent the rest of their life completely dependent. Whereas somebody else at an early stage, like Stephen Hawking, might be in that same position and manage to live their life in that particular way. So it's not about us putting a value on a particular state of life. It's how that person sees their own life. And we shouldn't pretend that a certain level of euthanasia doesn't happen. I think there's a bit of hypocrisy here. There's Finbarr talked of us letting people die slowly, and I think we should be more honest about this, and I think if we're going to, we should relieve the agony of this. And as well as that, doctors around the world where euthanasia isn't allowed they'd deliberately overprescribe in case where both the doctor and the patient know that this will lead to the death, but that this will be prescribed. This will be the death ensued from the overprescription of painkillers. That it will be prescribed to the illness itself or a side effect of the painkillers. We had when Dr. Michael Irwin was here 2 years ago. He gave an example of Bertrand Dawson, the doctor who gave an overdose of morphine to King George V. And this is a case where this was actually involuntary euthanasia, but no one reading the circumstances, because at this time the king was unconscious and couldn't have agreed to the situation. But this was a case of where everyone else in the royal family agreed that this was the right thing to do, although for obvious reasons it wasn't mentioned, because there would have been high treason had it come out. But across the world, you see even people who are seeking euthanasia, relatives who will stay with their son or their husband while they're fighting to allow this person to be allowed to die, but staying with them during all this time. It's not that they want to end this. They still want to be with their person. They just want to save them, allow them the dignity of dying the way they would wish. And I'm not keeping an eye on time, but I'm probably running out of it. So I'm just going to go through, as mentioned, Oregon. This is, I just want to outline this in case I don't get a chance. In Oregon in '94, by a ballot measure, a level of euthanasia was approved by 51%. And there were a few conditions laid down. And whatever we think about the regulatory system, it's something, it can be there. So because somebody was terminally ill who would die within 6 months, where there were 2 witnesses to the situation, and one of them had no prior connection, whether family that they'd mentioned in the will by any chance, or they were their own family doctor. So 2 witnesses, one of them who had no connection, but someone who was clearly of a sound mental health when they're making a decision, and a 15-day waiting period between the time when this is agreed, so they've that period to change their mind. So this framework can be set out, and a few points to mention on this. One is that in '97 there was, as often we've seen in America, in states where something has changed, there's people tried to appeal it. In that case, it was 60% in favour. So over the few years, people realised this wasn't a slippery slope. Nothing else had happened. And the other point is that a very small number go ahead, even of those who apply in the first place, who will hold it there as a reserve. And then another point that 2 years ago, the Journal of Medical Ethics did a survey on this. They had at that stage 12 years of data, and they found there was, so this is something often brought up, there was no, of those groups that are considered vulnerable, there was no increase at all. That they weren't those who are old, those who are particularly disabled. In no way could you say that these people were highlighted, these people were targeted, and that their lives there's any pressure put on them by doctors or the uninsured, which is a big problem in America. These weren't the issues that came with it. So fundamentally, just when I'm finishing, I think this is. If you want to put it in this, use these simplistic terms, a pro-life idea. You're allowing someone their own life. You're allowing someone to see how to live their life, and you're allowing someone the dignity of dying, rather than putting through the extra agony. So on these bases, I move to propose.
So I call on the second opposition, Graham Kelly.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Auditor, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the last time I spoke in this debate, when this debate was held in the Society, I spoke in the proposition. This was 2 years ago. My perspective on this issue has changed quite a bit since then. Now, I'm a student radiation therapist, and the reason for this is I've since spent quite a lot of time working in palliative care units and dealing with and talking to the terminally ill, in fact, about this issue. It's strange they'll actually ask what my opinion of it is, even though, which is quite interesting. Now, I have one theme that I want to talk about tonight, and that will run continually throughout this speech, and this is the psychology of the issue, particularly focusing on the patient. I acknowledge that the aim of limiting a patient's pain and giving them the ultimate control over their destiny is a noble one, but there are several major flaws in this. Firstly, and this seems to have particularly come out in Will's speech, there seems to be a major underestimation in this room of the willingness of a patient to fight to survive, to carry on, no matter what. Simply put, people never want to die. These people that they're talking about want a release from their illness. They don't want to die. And most people, even the terminally ill, are very much conscious of the value of their own life, even at the end. We feel our current system enshrines this, that it says that no matter what, no matter how bad it gets, we are with you. We will ensure that you have as much life as possible. We will guarantee we will try and guarantee a certain standard of life. If we institutionalise euthanasia, we will fundamentally damage this stance. What I want to address next is some of the patients that have been euthanised by the Swiss organisation Dignitas. This is probably the best comparison of what could be introduced here. In June this year, The Guardian published a list of patients who have travelled to Switzerland to end their lives. It made for quite shocking reading. While I was saddened but not quite surprised to hear about a large number of terminal cancer patients willing to avail of these services, I was shocked and horrified by some of the other conditions that occupied this list. 2 patients suffering from Crohn's disease, which is non-fatal. 2 tetraplegics. 2 suffering from rheumatoid arthritis, which is non-fatal, and 17 multiple sclerosis patients. And as we are all quite aware from watching the 3rd series of The West Wing and listening to Toby Ziegler shout, MS is not fatal. What we can see here is a symptom of the true problem. This is the failure of the psychomedical services to properly prepare the patient to deal with what is a chronic illness. A failure to instil in the patient that they can still live a productive life, even with a debilitating illness. Look at Stephen, I love the NHS talking. No thanks, Kate. A failure to prepare the family of the patient to deal with the illness. A failure to treat the patient and not just the disease. These patients are suffering from a loss of hope and what could be described as what is a very serious case of depression. No thank you. While I understand that depression could be classified as a potentially fatal illness, that is to say that if left untreated, there is a potential for steps to be taken that could result in the end of the patient's life. This is not how we deal with that. We need our psychomedical services to be all that they can be, and then we won't need this. What we need is properly developed and properly funded systems that takes the patient from first diagnosis to the natural end of their life, prepares them psychologically for the inevitable outcome and everyone that goes with them, that prepares their relatives for the road ahead and provides all involved with whatever social aid that they need. What we need is a society to truly acknowledge the value of the lives of the ill and not see them as a burden, and not to not to simply to leave it at non-fatal illnesses. These services can prepare even the terminally ill to deal with their disease. I have great faith in the psycho-oncology services. I've seen them work very well myself to prepare patients for the end, to instil in them the effectiveness of modern pain relief. Yes, Anne?
Is anyone who does not want to continue living, in your mind, unbalanced? Is there any way that you could possibly conceive of someone actually just wanting to no longer live that is not mental, or
No, I'm not. What I'm not saying is that they're mental. What I'm saying is that where the disease is a major stressor upon them. And we're saying that like most of the issues that were brought out by William was that they had to be like within the bounds of psychologically stable, fully in knowledge of it. But we don't take into account the huge psychological stress that they're on as a result of their disease. And what I believe is that if they're not there, the reason they're under such stress is because they weren't properly prepared for it. Now, to move on, the effectiveness of modern pain relief is often underestimated in these sort of debates, but simply put, it is rather substantial, and that we are now able to leave a patient can, in many cases, be very little discomfort, using opiates, nerve blocks, and again, even radiation, and to facilitate them having a reasonable standard of life towards the end. What also needs to be discussed is the potential effect of the introduction of this policy on the mentality of the patient. It's not unreasonable for those patients suffering from chronic or life-threatening illnesses to see themselves as a burden to their family, a burden to friends, a burden to the state. It is not unreasonable for a patient to want it all to be over, and that burden on them to be lifted. But by simply introducing this policy, we may end up by putting pressure on such individuals to avail of it, simply because they feel they should, simply because they feel it's noble to do so. Is that not simply diminishing the value of life in the patient's own eyes? Not to mention the fact that an unscrupulous individual could have, the effect they could have, by convincing someone that they are in fact a burden for their own gain. Now, patients can also develop a bias against a type of treatment because of seeing the treatment fail in another and often completely unrelated case. We don't want them to see this as the only 100% effective treatment for their illness, using their right to refuse treatment for fear that the normal treatment will not work. Lastly, what about the effect on the doctor-patient relationship? For a patient to be willing to engage in a treatment, they need to trust their physician. They need to know that they are willing to fight for them and with them, no matter what. Now, we live in a very small country. Everyone knows someone who was treated by such and such who had X. In this country, consultants are nearly superstars. If it gets to a patient that their consultant even allowed a previous patient to be euthanized, they may feel that they will want the same for them. The fear alone can damage the trust the patient puts in their doctor. It casts doubt in his decision making, a potentially fatal thing indeed. Why are there so few doctors who we can get to actually speak in proposition to this? Because it's often seen as professional suicide. Ladies and gentlemen, every action, every decision, every illness is fundamentally life-threatening. What we need to do is support the patient and their families in the realisation of this and coming to terms with their inevitable end. We need to see life in all manifestations as worthwhile, and for those reasons I oppose. Thank you.
So I now call on Mr. Dick Spicer, who's our third proposer. Mr. Spicer is chairman of the Irish Humanist Association, a founder of the Society, and he was previously in the campaign to separate church and state.
I suppose others have made the case that speaking against euthanasia, one often would bring in a religious or Christian perspective. And I suppose it's inevitable in a way that humanists would take a contrary view, because the view that under all circumstances life should be preserved is at heart a religious view. It doesn't mean that humanists would support euthanasia in its crudest form. I mean, I believe the title of the lecture should have been Voluntary Euthanasia, because I would certainly oppose euthanasia, which is imposed on someone. And this imposition of a religious view on everyone, like, you're not going to be allowed to avail of a way out because it conflicts with my religious perspective. At heart, that is profoundly undemocratic. And I do not believe it serves the common good to create such a society. In Ireland, according to the census, the fastest growing minority in the state is the non-religious community. If you added together those who said no religion and did not answer, you got 250,000 in the last census. Far larger than any other minority, and in fact larger than all the others put together. Yet you might hear a row going on at the moment about Protestant schools. We don't have any, and we're a far larger community than the Protestant community.
Point of information. Don't you think that some non-religious people are also against euthanasia?
Yes, humanism is a diverse body. The common thread in humanism would be that you do not have the right to impose religious views on those who don't share. I suppose I've heard humanism summed up as good without God. In other words, you can promote an ethical perspective on life without having to root it in a divinity or eternal damnation or eternal reward. I think it's a far more substantial basis for ethics than fear and fantasy. Euthanasia. Oh, incidentally, UCD beat you to it. They set up a Humanist society last month with 160 members, just to get you thinking. Euthanasia cuts across all perspectives. I have come across Christians who support voluntary euthanasia, who do not see it as their God's will that people should suffer needlessly. I suppose the reason it cuts across all perspectives is we're all going to die. Abortion is another issue where religious perspectives influence people's stance. But of course, that only affects women, and only a small percentage. But we're all going to die. We're all going to. Most of us get old and decrepit. And as I say, this issue shades from the living will, or advance directive, which the Law Society just recommended recently be given legal status. In other words, that somebody who signs a directive in advance that they do not wish, under certain circumstances, to receive treatment to prolong their life, that they will not have it imposed upon them. Now that shades into voluntary euthanasia, doesn't it? Sometimes it might be hard to draw the line. I quite agree with the last speaker about dignitas and some of the statistics that were quoted. I do not like what's been going on in Switzerland at all. I think it's a bit shabby. It takes place too quickly without proper consultation, proper preparation. I think it's a very strong reason why it should be legalized in this country, because then we can control how it's done. But you can't control what's going on in Switzerland. People are just heading off, as somebody said, with non-fatal illnesses, but I wouldn't quite be so dogmatic as to say that unless it's a fatal illness. Who best can judge your quality of life but yourself near the end? I'll get personal. I'll tell you the situation with my mother, who is a Christian. She's 93, she'll be 94 on the 8th of December. She's in a nursing home. She has, through glaucoma, detached retina, and cataracts. She is virtually totally blind, and they can't operate. She's virtually stone deaf. She can't get out of bed because she's had these mini strokes and she has no sense of balance. She's in constant pain from a fractured shoulder 4 years ago, which won't heal. The medication, which is a type of morphine, I'm told, is not entirely effective. Anytime I see her, which is a couple of times a year because she's in Canada, she explains to me very carefully, all her friends are gone, all her joys in life are gone. She can't even listen to music, which was the last joy left to her. She has no sense of taste. She can't see. She can't even look at a photograph of her grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And she says to me, I wish I was not here. I wish I didn't wake up. Now, she does not like her situation. I was in a debate with a Christian a while back on this issue, and she brought up the subject of her mother, who was helped out of life by the family doctor by giving large doses of morphine. And yet she opposed voluntary euthanasia. I thought it was a very unfair burden to put on a doctor. But he had to decide, he had to judge whether she might, in a few weeks' time, being as she was a fairly fundamental Christian, this woman, whether she might take a turn against him and perhaps cause him to be prosecuted. Her doctor has to make a call on her future mental attitude to what he's doing. I think it's most unfair. If voluntary euthanasia was legalised, doctors could breathe easy under such circumstances. Family could breathe easy that there wasn't any sleight of hand going on with pressure being put on, unlike in the situation with Dignitas. The first chairperson of the Humanist Association was a dear friend of mine, Heather Elwood, who developed ovarian cancer. And she died at the age of 55 in a hospice. And I went in to see her I saw her about 2 days before she died. From a woman who was very vain and very proud of her looks and attitude. She was lying in this bed, bald, full of tubes. And she said to me, Dick, I've been like this for a couple of weeks. They keep bringing me back. She didn't want to be there. She was comatose for 23 hours out of 24. But for fear of being accused of euthanasia, the hospice kept bringing her back to consciousness. I thought that was a form of absolute cruelty. And don't forget, this could happen to any of you. This is something we all face. I feel voluntary euthanasia with safeguards, and these safeguards would have to be debated nationally, and I feel that Ireland would ensure that the safeguards were very effective. Well, you'd have to have more than one doctor, well, you'd have to make sure somebody wasn't being pressured, well, you'd have to make sure that certain conditions in terms of their quality of life were met. But at the end of the day, they're the ones that can judge. I have a friend with MS who has heard me on the radio debating this and who has marked me down. I'm not so sure about MS not being fatal. Perhaps somebody else can enlighten me, but I'm under the impression that the various organ muscles of the body shut down, and that at the end of the day you can have great difficulty breathing and swallowing. And I know that my friend doesn't want to get to that stage, so he has me marked down to help him. I don't want to, but I do know other people with MS who have still got the use of their chin, who don't want to be there. I wouldn't want to be there. I wouldn't want to be kept there. So, voluntary euthanasia. Nobody's forcing it on you. If you're a Christian, if you want to suffer, if you see it as ennobling, if you see it as desirable, nobody's forcing you to seek voluntary euthanasia. But I feel that you should concede the same rights to those who do not share religious views, and that you should allow people who want to obey and who say that their quality of life is so abysmal and who have been protected by safeguards. I think in the name of humanity it should be legalized. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Dr. Donal O'Mathuna, who is a pharmacy graduate, former scholar, who now lectures in healthcare ethics in TCU.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and other speakers, audience. It's certainly very difficult to follow on from the things that Mr. Spicer has talked about. It's very difficult to lay out a position which is saying that what his mother would like or what his good friend wanted to have are, in my opinion, the wrong choices. But at the same time, there are many other stories. I've sat with a good friend of mine, a neighbour, young man in his 40s, as he suddenly went downhill with cancer, and over a year sat with their family as they tried to grapple with all of this, and with the young children wondering why Daddy was getting to be so different, and eventually to see him fade away. Or to sit with a friend who was looking forward to retiring in a couple of years and started to get afflicted with an illness, again cancer, and to sit with him as he and his wife wondered, well, you know, why should we go through with any of these treatments? Why should we put up with any of this pain? Why should we keep going? And then to go and visit him and to sit with him feeling embarrassed, not knowing whether he could hear me or not, wondering, is it worth my while talking to him? Does he hear anything? And only later to find out that at other times he had told other people that when different people came in to talk with him or to read to him, that he was able to hear those things and that it did comfort him. So there is really, I think, two systems that are being proposed here, and we're going to have to make a choice not simply about for or against, but what are the values and the beliefs that underlie the whole mentality and the whole value system that we're talking about here. Because death is a very difficult topic. We never want to talk about it. I think no matter what age we get to, I think there's a big part of us feels like, well, it's still a few years away. We don't want to talk about it. It brings up pain because we probably have people that we know who have died in difficult circumstances or maybe died very suddenly, died very tragically. And it's painful to talk about. It's very hard. And then we have images of hospitals that want to hook us up to every newfangled machine that they've got. They want to try out new drugs. They want to, do a surgery because it might help a little bit here, or they want to kind of feed us on these tubes or hook up this machine. And it seems like in many cases that there's this medical treadmill that once you get on it, you just can't get off of it. They're going to run you until you die from the treatment, as opposed to any illness that you might have had when you first showed up with them. And so we get the question, is lethal injection, is voluntary euthanasia the red button that we need to have to stop this treadmill, to be able to get off? Well, I would hold that there is a different approach, that there's one in which there is a difficult and challenging and gut-wrenching type of decision-making that needs to go on, where a person can pursue treatments to the point at which it becomes as clear as possible to the medical team, to the patient and their families, and to all those involved, where they can see that what had been tried is not working, or it's becoming so burdensome on the patient that this really needs to be withdrawn. But I would hold that there's a very different approach to medicine and to healthcare and to our community when we say that part of that system is to step in and say, well, then we're going to end this person's life, as opposed to a system that says we are going to move from doing everything we can to try to treat this person and to cure this illness to the point where the approach has to change, where we have to support this person in whatever natural life they have left and help them to move towards the end in as comfortable and as compassionate a way as possible. Now, we've heard that we have practices going on in various countries like the Netherlands, Switzerland and Oregon. I think some of the differences that we're seeing there are because there are different things legalized in those different jurisdictions. In Oregon, it's assistance in suicide that has been legalized, that has been taken up by very few people, and that I think demonstrates that many people are not pursuing that avenue because they feel like their pain is out of control or they're unable to get the care that they need. But instead, the most common answer that people get or that people give for using that law is that they wanted to retain control of their decision about when they would end their life. And I think that's a fundamental difference. In the Netherlands, the system is not working as well as you might be told by some. The Remelink report has been conducted on a few different occasions and found that there are about 4,000 cases each year in which people make use of the law over there, and yet there still are close to 2,000 situations in which people have not requested to have a lethal injection, and yet they are receiving that type of injection, either at the decision of the family members or the decision of the doctors that this would be what might be best for this patient, but it is not the voluntary approach that we might like to think that it could be. So there are problems in the way these systems have been put into practice. And fundamentally, what I feel is the distinction between these systems is that as somebody goes through the process of coming to the end of life, as pain develops or as they see various parts of their body losing normal function, is that they're asking a question, is my life worth living? And we can either respond by saying yes, and I'm going to help you try to find a way to keep on living, or we can respond and say, no, your life isn't worth living, and here's some help to end it. I think that's as blunt as it gets. We're offering through voluntary euthanasia control. We're saying that you can keep control over this process in your life, and yet repeatedly we don't have that sort of control. Repeatedly we find that people who had decided that they wanted to end their lives, that the death came earlier, or that other things developed, that there's an illusion of control that is being put out there. And there's also an illusion of choice, that it becomes very difficult to know where is the pressure being placed on people. Are people simply feeling that they are a burden and that they ought to move on, as opposed to truly having a free choice in this whole area? What I think we need to offer is a system and become a community which offers a very different set of values. One in which compassion is the top priority in our healthcare system, where people are not worried about when is the transition from promoting health, trying to extend my life, to where they're going to get to the point of saying, well, now we're going to start causing death. That there is an impact that introducing euthanasia has on the healthcare practitioners. What is it going to do to our doctors and nurses to know that now their trade is not simply about healing, about helping people to get as much suffering as possible removed, but instead is one about where at some point they're going to become the purveyor of death to these people. Companionship is crucial in this sort of situation. And this is where the answer is not simply about developing a better healthcare system. This is about the community that we want to build up. Are we prepared to go and visit our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers when they're in the nursing homes? Are we taking the time to go around our communities and find out how come Mrs. Murphy down the road never comes out anymore? What are we going to make as the emphasis of what we're going to have in the way we build our neighbourhoods? Is it companionship, or is it independence? Is it let those other people be alone, let them live their own lives so that they can just take care of themselves and do what they want behind their own doors? It's going to take an emphasis on conversation, on listening to people, on talking about their needs, finding out that, for example, the pain medication isn't working anymore, rather than just assuming, well, we put them on this dose last week, it'll be all right, we'll just keep giving them the same thing. And listening to people, listening to patients, addressing those needs, seeing what really is working and what isn't. It involves a commitment to the person in all of their different ways, to their social network, to their relationships, to their spiritual needs, if they want to address those. That it's not simply about the individual, but it's about the whole person. We need to look for closure and promote a society where we can talk about the fact that death is coming to all of us, that we don't create false expectations, where we don't set up circumstances where people think, well, you know, I've got this pain and the doctor and everybody else in the family knows that it's terminal cancer, and yet nobody has talked to the patient about it and helped them to try to start to think through and come to closure about all of this. And it's one into which I think we need to promote continuity. That one of the things that I think a spiritual belief system brings is that there is a continuity, that this death is not simply the end of life and everything as it might seem to be. That the afterlife offers a time in which people can see that there is going to be a way for the soul to continue, and that this death is not as bad as it might ultimately be, particularly if viewed from a materialistic perspective, where this simply is the end and that's all there is to it. But that instead, the continuity of realizing that if I do believe in a God or in an afterlife, that this can actually help me to accept death, not to be as fearful about it, and to actually help in the moving on through that. So ultimately, as I said, I think what we're faced with here is really a decision about what sort of a society do we want to promote. Do we want one which is based on individualism, on purely focusing on individual rights and letting everybody get exactly what they want themselves, or one in which we take the types of difficult steps that are necessary for all of us to build a community in which people will say to themselves, I am in pain, I'm having a difficult time here, but the role that I can play in this society, in whatever way I can contribute right to the very moment, it may simply be that my last gift can be the way that I face my death, willing to accept the uncertainty that it has, and yet willing to offer the way that I die as my last gift to the community to help them face the difficulties that will face them in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now call on Byrne, who's our fourth proposition.
Mr. Chairman, before you, are you a maiden?
Yeah.
Okay. So for all maidens, we give them an option to accept their maiden rights, which is basically nobody can ask them a question of maiden between the first and second bell. And if you accept the maiden's rights, then we won't ask you any questions. But if you reject them, we'll give you a round of applause.
Okay, well, I'll reject them then. Mr. Chairman, the adjudicator, members of the College Historical Society, and ladies and gentlemen. Well, there have been a few sort of personal stories about sort of people dying in hospital, so I'll give one too. This summer, my granddad was taken very ill very suddenly, and he was brought into hospital. And when myself and the rest of my family arrived, we were told that he will be dying, and he was given the last rites by the priest. 2 days later, he still wasn't dead, and was again, when the doctors decided, no, he's going to die tonight, was given the last rites by the priest. Then, another 2 days later, he still wasn't dead. Most of my family were completely distraught by this. They were trying to understand. They're trying to come to terms with, we all know he's dying, but when is it going to happen?
We all had lives to try and pursue, and we couldn't be in the hospital all the time. Eventually, though, he did die that night, and for a lot of people it was relief almost. But this really does raise the question. It's not just about the patient himself, but also the family, because the family do suffer hugely when people are dying. So in response to the first stop's point about we should just let them die, just letting someone die is incredibly, incredibly difficult, mainly on the people who have to watch that person die and move on. It's really about a patient's best interests, isn't it? So there was a doctor in England called Dr. Cox, and he had a 70-year-old patient who had rheumatoid arthritis. And I know it's not a fatal disease, but she was in extreme pain, beyond all levels of painkillers of any kind. And her family and the woman herself begged Dr. Cox to help her out of the world, and so he did. And subsequently he was tried and convicted with attempted murder. Attempted murder because the court couldn't define if it was the disease that killed her or Dr. Cox's injection. But isn't that terrible? She and her family, who were suffering tremendously at this, were begging the doctor to help them, which is what doctors are meant to do. They're meant to help sick people. And yet he lost his medical license and is now currently in prison, I believe. Now, there is a thing at the moment where you have the right to refuse any treatment, and you can also sign DNRs in case you become incapable of using your right to refuse any treatment. Now, this is euthanasia of a sort, and it's been already mentioned, but the thing is it morally better to allow someone to die, or is it better to actively commit an act of killing them, but to spare pain? Pain not just for the patient, but pain for their family and loved ones. It's really about freedom of choice. Yes, we do not get to choose everything about our lives and what happens in the world around us, but every choice that we can make, we should be allowed to make. And the government, or anyone else for that matter, shouldn't turn around and say, you're not allowed to make that choice because it disagrees with the value system that we have. Now, I'd just like to say one more thing, and that is the value of life, which has been thrown around a lot in this debate, not just in this room, but generally the euthanasia debate, but it's been mentioned a few times. Now, I just ask you, and this may sound a bit controversial, so don't all boo at me, but to take an objective look at the value of life. There's lots of life on the planet Earth. Human beings are the only intelligent one that we know of, but there are trees, there are dogs and cats, and leaves, and all animals and bugs. And basically, why is human life more valuable, more sacred, or more important than any of this other life, which we, human beings, destroy so readily and without care? There's no condition in the human psyche that says human life is incredibly important and not to be messed about with, otherwise there'd never be any murders. Another example of this is millions of people die every year from TB, a disease which we have both the cure and the medication to save people. And yet, Western, American and European pharmaceutical companies are more concerned with making profits than saving the lives of potentially millions of people. So what does that say about our value of life? The philosophy that life is too valuable to just throw away casually like this isn't a good one to make, when there's so much evidence which says that we really don't actually care that much about life, even though we may pretend to or say that we do or mean to, but we don't in actual fact. Which really means that euthanasia should be legalised based on the principle of, we should be allowed to choose. We have a right to life, but that doesn't mean we're forced to live it. We can make decisions, and they will have effects on us and other people. But at the same time, if we have the opportunity to choose things, and we should make the opportunity to choose these things. But based on philosophies that don't hold true, and notions and ideas, we should give people the option to decide what they want. And as has already been said in this debate, so I'm only going to quickly remind you of it all. No one else can say, I'm in pain, I want it to stop. You can't turn around to me and say, no, you're not in pain, you don't know what your own feeling. So, as far as I'm concerned, you should all propose the motion that we should legalise euthanasia.
So I call on Bella Patrick.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Auditor, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not a religious person, I'm not conservative. I very much believe in live and let live, no pun intended, but I am against the legalisation of euthanasia. That's right, atheist liberal against legalisation of euthanasia. Bear with me. Tonight I'm going to try my best not to use the word wrong. I feel my views on whether it's philosophically wrong or not to legalise euthanasia is neither here nor there, and I'm not going to soften death with an afterlife. And I'm not going to go on about playing God. I'm a scientist, love playing God, do it all the time. Instead, I'm going to try my best to convince you that while you may have your own philosophical views on euthanasia, that it is ethically irresponsible and completely impractical now in this world that we live in today. So I'm going to talk a little about the reasonable doubt involved in euthanasia, what it undermines in society, and really try to challenge why anybody would agree with it. In law, you convict someone of a crime if you think it is beyond reasonable doubt that they are guilty. This is how it works. So I'm going to point out the reasonable doubt in some aspects of euthanasia. For instance, by the fact that euthanasia is available, that would be a subconscious pressure on someone, that they think it is expected of them to do the honourable thing, to stop being a burden. Can the prop prove that no one will feel guilted into euthanasia? No. Can I prove that someone definitely will? No, of course not. But my way, no one's killed. Palliative care specialists report that requests to be euthanized are often used by patients to assess their worth and value to others, and that anybody saying that they should get euthanized only confirms their fears that they are not valued and they are just a burden. So if you have a living will, this has been brought up a lot. You have a will, you say, if I'm in a vegetated state, I want to be euthanized. Shouldn't that be okay? Well, no, because it's a will, as in, I suppose I will. You cannot assume to know how you'll feel after you've had a stroke. You cannot assume to know how you'll feel after you've been in a serious accident. You cannot speak. You cannot tell anybody that you do not want to be killed. Is it just me, or is that not the scariest concept? The bottom line is there's too much risk. You can't undo death. It is the ultimate finality. We don't allow people with brain tumours to drive, because their mental abilities have been affected, but we can allow them to decide when to end their lives. We can physically restrain mentally ill people if they're hurting themselves. So we'd have to have some sort of mental assessment of people requesting to be euthanized. Then who makes this final decision? 2 doctors, 3, 4? How can the opinion of 3 people, yes, doctors are just people, hold enough weight to say that someone should die before they would naturally? Our health system, as Finbarr said, cannot support a system as complicated as this. It isn't functioning as it is. The legalisation of euthanasia would also undermine so many things in our society. It would undermine the fight, as Graham said. It would undermine that unspoken rule that you go into a hospital and they do everything they can to make sure that you're okay. There is not this section in the medicine cabinet, lethal injections. When you are dealing with a serious illness, no one around you should be saying it's okay to die. When you're having those particularly hard days and you want to throw in the towel, no system or legislation should encourage you to do so. It would also undermine the financing and provision of proper palliative care. As it only stands, we have very little. We have the hospice, which receives minimal government help. It would undermine research into medicines and therapies to improve the quality of life of people suffering from degenerative and lifelong illnesses. Think of the advances medicine has had, even in the past decade. It's highly possible that many of the illnesses will be much more bearable in just a matter of years. But the people who have been euthanized already won't know that because they're dead. You can't, thank you, Kate. You can't undo death. So who's at risk? Ideally, euthanasia would be used for someone of sound mind who suffered and decided, that's it, I've had enough. But But the same legislation would be used to abuse society's most vulnerable individuals. We don't yet live in some utopia where justice prevails all the time. No, unfortunately, we live in a world where there are 1,840 cases of confirmed elder abuse last year. That's only the ones we know about. We live in a world where people do things like physically and emotionally abuse their elderly relatives. Organisers of the Elder Abuse Hotline say the recession is the cause of a huge increase in elderly people being subjected to more and more abuse from family members over issues such as money, land and wills. The world is full of greedy, underhanded people. We can't have something as powerful as assisted suicides. Not in this world, not yet. Don't you realise that most of us in this room are going to grow old if we're lucky? If bird flu or swine flu or mouse flu don't kill us, we will grow old, our immune systems will get weak, and a lot of us will get diseases due to our old age. So is it going to become some sort of trend that you hit 85 and you're not healthy, you get euthanized? I don't want to live in some sort of real-life version of Logan's Run. And if you don't get that reference, you need to get out less. No, thank you. I think it's funny in Europe, we have this really warped view on things. We think euthanasia, modern, progressive, I dig it. But we think death penalty, no, that's American, we don't like that at all. Now, I'm not drawing a direct comparison at all, but don't you see the risks are the same? While in an ideal world, you can justify it in some cases, but we don't live in an ideal world, and all it takes is for one innocent person to be killed, for the whole thing not to be worth it. So I can justify someone of sound mind, completely sane, who is suffering from a terrible illness, not to be allowed to choose to be euthanized. Because by the very fact that they could, means that someone vulnerable could be euthanized, someone depressed, someone being guilted into it. No system or safeguards could ever be foolproof. When humans are involved, you can't eliminate human error. And for this very reason, euthanasia should not be legalized, and neither should the death penalty. At the end of the day, death is too final. If you are in favour of legalization of euthanasia, it could be because you think if I grow old or get some illness, I really want that option to be there for me, because I don't want to deal with that. Because I know I'm of a strong mind and no one could ever force me into it. Well done, you're of a strong mind. But not everybody is, and we need to protect those people. The only reason we aren't having this house would provide better palliative care is because it wouldn't interest people. It's easy to say you're for euthanasia and avoid thinking about the hard issues like old people being abused and what happens when a parent says they want their child to be euthanized. And you think euthanasia, that's edgy. I'm going to be radical and say I'm for it because it's much easier than justifying them why you're against it. But I'm asking now to think about all the things that could go wrong. Think about the value of life rather than the cost. Be radical and say no. I demand better palliative care, more counselling for people with illnesses, and recognise that it isn't as simple as we'd like to think. Be radical and oppose the motion. Thank you.
The impromptu contributions, and to propose is Matthew Corbally here.
Wait, Maiden's rights, by the way. Okay, before I get on to the main points I had planned, I would like to take up the idea of how we should not have euthanasia because of the idea of how people would abuse it. Do not think people are abusing that now. Just because euthanasia is not allowed does not mean that there's loads of families that will be pressuring doctors to make choices that would lead to their elderly relatives dying. The phrase comes to mind, give someone an inch, now take a mile. When it comes to humans, people will abuse it. That is a given fact. For me, that's not nearly enough a reason to not do it. Sure, people will die. Sure, innocent people who have a chance of surviving will be pressured into it by their relatives, who are of questionable morality. But for me, that's not enough to not justify not giving all the proper healthcare and the proper options to people who will deserve it and will deserve a quick way out of it. All right, my main points. I was thinking of starting my speech on a somewhat humorous note on the benefits of euthanasia as regard to population control. But after the various heart-wrenching stories from the previous speech, guys, and also because I realised that if I was to do that, now I would keep referencing Soylent Green, the film, and that would alienate a lot of the non-nerds in the audience. When I was researching the subject, I came to an interesting viewpoint and realisation, in that one of the key points of our society is like the one that's been referenced multiple times, is the idea of freedom of choice and control over your own destiny. And, well, so long as it's legal and it's not like harming anyone else, what you do with yourself is allowed. But I found out that because suicide has not been decriminalised, then there's no law against suicide. And to a weird quirk of the laws, that because that, well, a lot of people can't do suicide on their own because of the innate aversion to self-harm and killing yourself. So they would be unable to achieve it, even if they want to die and escape pain by their own means, and so they require assistance from doctors. But because of the laws of euthanasia forbidding this, the law is actually discriminating against those people who are unable to commit suicide themselves. Which I find to be somewhat ironic in that a law designed ostensibly to save life is actually causing and continuing pain. Furthermore, on the point of freedom of choice, one of the foundations of a liberal Western society, is the idea of being responsible for your own destiny and your own future. Now, sure, we can say a lot about how we have a lot of medical science has come a long way in the past few years, and how we can solve a lot of diseases. There's still loads of things that can come up from nowhere and really put us in lots of pain and make our life a living hellhole. And I think we deserve, people who are in that situation deserve the right. It is their inalienable right of freedom of choice to choose when they want to end their life and when they want to get out of that, rather than being forced into a horrible situation where pretty much like every situation has been described previously. And back to the point about how we should be caring for people instead of simply killing them off. That ignores the fact how much economic strain that will put on the hospitals. I imagine that most of you are aware of how hospitals these days have a lot of material problems, like they're understaffed, they have a problem with bed space and medical supplies. And if those of you from America who now don't know, medicine is quite the expensive business. Now, taking this all into account, one would think that anything that could lessen that strain on the hospitals and on... Go ahead.
Do you think that a person who might want to put that financial strain on their family might choose to die because they don't want to put their family in?
Yes, I do. But then that's back to my point of freedom of choice. By allowing this, it has the benefit of allowing... I'm not going to admit it's like a totally moral benefit, moral thing, I'm going to admit that. But it does have the benefit of freeing up more bed space, and putting less strain on the hospital's resources, which allows for more people's lives to be saved in the long run. And in the end, who do you think the doctors should focus on saving? Who should they save the bed space for? A little child who is like suffering from, going for the child option, who's suffering from, if he's really unlucky, AIDS, and they can give him a bed and help him get through that. Or should they focus on an elderly spinster, living with no relatives left, no friends left? Yes, I know, I'm making an extreme thing. It's my first day. Who would you go for? Someone who has so much, has got a huge future, has got so much ahead of them, and someone who has really nothing left. And for my final point, I shall present the plight of those who are affected by this decision of legalising euthanasia. Now, as we've all agreed that we really can comprehend all of the pain that they would be going through, like both the physical and the emotional pain of, say, being a burden upon your family, and of losing your independence and having to rely upon everyone to see to your every need. Like when I was doing some research, motor neuron syndrome in particular struck me because it's a really hellish disease. Where your nerves just start to fail, you lose your motor skills, your ability to talk, well, not really lose, but your ability to talk and walk and move is impaired. And it's crippling emotional pain. How you've got to rely on everyone to help you, your family, your friends, loads of social workers and occupational therapists. Now, do not think it is perfectly fair to give someone the right to get out of that, to stop being a burden on everyone else, and to escape all that horrible pain and the sense of losing yourself. Which would you prefer? To be in pain for years and to be a burden to those you love? Or would you prefer to end it painlessly and peacefully? Mr. Chair, Mr. Auditor, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society and various legal aliens, I beg to propose.
Thank you very much. And to oppose is Martin James Melvin.
I'm not a maiden. I spoke before this house several years ago, and it's the first time I've spoken before a debating house in about 7 years, so please bear with me. To start, ladies and gentlemen, I give a lot of thought to this motion today, and I was in the boys' toilets, and there was a really brilliant phrase just written on the wall, and it said, "No one dies a virgin. Life screws us all." I thought it was brilliant. I think it's true. There's a point here. Every one of us will die, and every one of us will have friends that die. And a lot of us will go through a lot of pain in that process. I mean, just at the top of my head, as you know, about 1 in 3 people in this room will get cancer. About 1 in 5 and 1 in 6, depending on the surveys that you read, will die of cancer. It's a difficult illness. It's an illness, though, that we can deal with. In the past, as was mentioned, mortality was a far more difficult issue. People died earlier, they died slowly, and they died far more painfully. Pain is a motivator. Pain controls. Pain shapes us. Pain changes us. Pain compels research into science and technology which can be used to reduce that pain. Pain brings out our humanity. Pain brings out the very best in us. Heroes are born out of pain. And pain is perhaps one of the most important parts of human dignity and perhaps the most important part of human life. Yes, I'll take this point.
I absolutely disagree with everything you've said in relation to pain being a wonderful and brilliant thing. And I think most of our population would. So why can't they have their voice and be allowed to legalise euthanasia? Why is it the minority that thinks that pain is awesome that are leading this?
Okay, first of all, I have not said pain is always going to be good, but there are tremendous advantages to pain. We suffer pain for a reason. We have this emotion built into us that was evolved, that we developed over time to motivate us and change our society. Simple examples of that are how pain treatments have evolved over the last 10 to 15 years. I'll take your point.
Euthanasia will not eradicate pain.
I never said euthanasia would eradicate pain, but I will say that suffering through pain changes us, compels us to become better people, changes our society, and it is not automatic. It is not automatic that pain is a bad thing, and it's something that we can definitely deal with, and it's something I think that cannot always be put down simply as being something as negative. I'm going to get to that a little bit later. 4 months ago, I had a friend called John Graff, and I don't want that name recorded, if that's all right. And John was a good friend of mine. John is someone I grew up with. He was a little bit shorter than me. He had black hair and blue eyes. He was a student, like many people here. And he had a very, very difficult time. And things didn't go well for John, and we lost John. John didn't make it. Suicide and euthanasia, they're basically the same thing. Euthanasia is a decision to end your life, and so is suicide. It's a conscious realization that things have reached such a point that you can't continue. And I strongly oppose euthanasia for that reason. I don't believe ever we can come to a decision and say that the fundamental being that we have has become so compromised and so destroyed and so dim and hopeless that we have to end it. I think that there is an intrinsic value to life that is ultimately undermined by introduction of euthanasia under any settings and under any circumstances. I also have the counter argument too as well. Earlier this year, my granny died, and she suffered from a long-term degenerative disease called Lewy body's disease. It's like Alzheimer's, but you get Parkinson's and your muscles contract, and you get a progressive, as I said, degeneration disease and a loss of your cognitive properties. And I know my parents suffered through it a lot because it went on for over 10 years. But I know my granny, and I know myself, and I know that the value of life is more important than simply satisfying our desire to end pain. That although we all suffer through pain, it achieves things. It has a motivation and it has a force that can genuinely be used for good. Pain can have virtue. There's one last, I'm going to finish on this point, on freedom of choice. I worked in the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Texas for some time in the States. And what people don't seem to realize is that the cost of chemotherapy or serious treatment in the US is enormous. 3 years ago, the cost of one course of chemotherapy was $70,000 US. $70,000 US. Okay? You're all going to get old, and some of you may not end up with insurance, and some of you may be in a situation where you realize that your family, hypothetically, may end up in a situation where $70,000 may be required for a course of chemotherapy. Can you imagine the pressure that would put you under to choose to inflict possibly that burden on your family if you didn't have the money? It's an extremely difficult issue, and I don't really believe that in situations where there is private healthcare and that you can really do it. And the pressure on that is just, it's too much, it's enormous, and it's not possible to make, to be fair, a fully independent choice. You're going to be weighed by the costs and the issues involved, and that's only one course of chemotherapy. That does not include the drugs, surgeries, and any complications that could arise. So because of that, ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to oppose the motion.
Thank you very much. Well, now I've got to put the motion to the floor. And the motion is that this House would legalise euthanasia. And all those in favour say aye. Aye. And all those against say nay. Nay. I think the ayes have it. My job at this stage to sum up and to respond to some of the points that have been made. And I've been a doctor for a long time. I've actually looked after a lot of people right to the end. And sometimes it's to the bitter end, unfortunately. And people do ask, more frequently than is alluded to, that they have their paths eased. And doctors do respond. And a lot of the debate is dominated by the success that the hospice movements have had in controlling pain. But people die more miserably, in my own experience, from other illnesses, and like MS, but particularly motor neuron disease. Motor neuron disease is a terrible disorder where people essentially seem to drown in their own secretions. And it is becoming commoner. It's a very, very difficult disease. So there are diseases and terminal diseases that we still haven't been able to ease people's suffering. I don't know if any of you have read Jean-Michel Bauby's book, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, which is a wonderful account of the locked-in syndrome, where his brain was completely functioning, and the only physical attribute he had was his upper eyelid, with which he dictated his book. And of course, that's a wonderfully creative way that he was able to use that awful disease. But then against that, there are other people who have an absolutely terrible time, and it surely must be everybody's enormous fear that something like that would happen. Now, the reality is that most people want to die at home. All of us would like to die at home among our things and among our family and friends. But actually the reality is, and Finbarr alluded to this, is that most people die in hospital. And they get sucked into dying in acute hospitals, which are geared to save people's lives. And this is the root, I think, of a lot of the debate that we're having, is that from an economic point of view, the last 6 months of your life is the most expensive. And in many ways it's the most pointless. People don't want to be in acute care for the last 6 months of their lives. They may well want to be in some form of kind care, some form of rehabilitation. And when you talk to people, what they want is a comfortable death. They don't want to die alone. I have a friend whose father died alone on a railway station, and it haunts him to this day. Most people want to die comfortably with good medical and nursing care. And I think Graham made that point. I think from my own profession, we're like one large PR machine, really. You can see there's an entire medical system which is geared to give an increasingly fearful people more hope. People are terrified. We're living longer. People are more terrified than ever. And we've bought into that. We all buy into that, giving good news. This university, whenever there's a discovery, it's put on the web, and it's good news for people out there. But of course, what has happened is that we haven't balanced it with compassion. I taught medical students for years. We very rarely talk about compassion. We always talk about hope. We always talk about the latest discovery. We don't talk about compassion, and we don't talk about mercy. These are not part of our vocabulary, and it's a very important part of our vocabulary. And I think if you want to change things, you actually have to change us in the way we use language, because language is very important. There is a real issue as to how we protect people. Many of you will not have been ill, but if you're chronically ill, it does sap your will to live. It saps your energy. It's very difficult to say no. It's very difficult to say no to doctors. It's very difficult to say no to pushy relatives who are in significant debt. It's going to be very, very difficult to protect the vulnerable. And the vulnerable are not always old. I think Dick spoke very movingly about somebody who is very ill and yet condemned to keep living, which is what some people describe it as. But how do we protect people who are taking up too much resources? That's a big issue for people. People do have an innate sense of fair play, and they do know that they're getting this pointless treatment in very good hospitals, that they're perhaps keeping other people out. And from my own point of view, I need to know what society wants doctors to do. One of our surgical colleagues, who's an American called Atul Gawande, I don't know if anybody's read any of the stuff, and he has written recently about doctors who assist in the death penalty. Now, the way they frame that, the doctors who assist in that, is that it's part of euthanasia. And one of them, called Carl Musso, has come out and said, yes, I help with the death penalty. And one or two others have as well. And their lives have been endangered. So I'm very much a practitioner. And from our point of view, there are people who feel very strongly about the sanctity of life. And part of their ethos is that for these doctors that have said, yes, we're getting involved in the death penalty, there are people who feel that they have transgressed a line. They've also transgressed a line because of their licensing authority. Now, somebody mentioned about our friend from radiation therapy, mentioned that this isn't something that doctors debate. It's not something that is a lively issue in medicine because we're licensed. We have a license, and our license is very geared towards active living, keeping people alive. So it's not something that's debated. And any debate that's going to come into medicine from this is going to come from outside, like people here. It's going to come very much from outside. It's a very lively topic among people, is the whole issue of euthanasia. Ireland's, I do think, is exceptional in that we do have a facility in talking about death. People do like talking about death. They prefer going to funerals, I've discovered, than talking about death. But there is an ease that people have in talking about death, perhaps because we've experienced so much of it. The advance directives are clearly an important addition to what's going on. But from my point of view, I don't know, as somebody who's licensed to practice medicine, how, and Dick has brought this up, how I will, if I engage in withholding treatment from somebody as a consequence of an advance directive, I don't know what protection I have. And I don't know how family members will think about it. We all belong to family members, and families have different views. Some may be very anti, some may be very pro. And doctors are in a terribly vulnerable position in this, because if you do something that some member of the family doesn't agree with, then they have every right to complain to a regulatory body like the Medical Council, to actually sue. So doctors are extraordinarily vulnerable about this. And of course, we don't, in medical education, you come at it, many of you, from a philosophical point of view. We don't talk to our medical students about this. I don't know what the students I teach, maybe some here tonight, I don't know what they think about euthanasia. But it's much easier before something when it's a very distant proposition. As I get older, I've become much less radical. There's a conservative breaking out in me all the time, and I'm much more thoughtful about issues like euthanasia than I was maybe 30 or 40 years ago. And to our science friend who says that scientists like playing God, or always play God, I think doctors like myself don't want to play God, and I think it's unfair to ask us to play God on this issue. I think it's been a wonderful debate. It's been a great privilege for me to chair it. I know it was a last-minute choice, but I'm very privileged to chair it and to be part of this long tradition. So thank you all very much, Auditor, and I hand the meeting back to you.